The next example that we're going to work through in section 1.4, our next thing that we're going to talk about, I should say, is our percent equation. Our percent equation is going to be kind of the key equation that we're going to use for the rest of the examples in this section. Right, so the percent equation is given by the formula percent times whole equals part. Right, one key thing to mention here as we're looking at this, we are going to be multiplying to get the part, and then we divide to get our percent or whole. So as we work through these, we can just use our general percent equation and then do a little bit of equation solving, or we can rearrange to look at these kind of different solving techniques as three different formulas. Notice that this first one is solved for our part. We're going to take a percent as a decimal and multiply it by our whole. Right? So it matches up what we set up here when we multiply to get the part. If we're looking for our whole or our percent, notice that we are using division. Right? When we're going through and we're working through these, we're going to be using our percents as decimals. So that means when we're actually doing our multiplication and division, in these two cases, we want to make sure we use our percent as a decimal. In this case, when we're finding a percent, we're going to get a decimal, but then we're going to shift our decimal places to get a whole number or an actual percent rather than a decimal representation of a percent. For the most part, we're going to round most of our answers to 1/10 of a percent. 1/10 of a percent is going to be one decimal place after our decimal point. So for example, 0.435, we're going to write as 43.5%. When it comes to this section in your homework, one thing that I previously mentioned is that we want to pay careful attention to our rounding. If you round incorrectly, my stat lab will count the answer as incorrect. So you want to make sure you're rounding correctly. You want to make sure you're rounding to the correct place value. So again, in the Math 126 portion on D2L, there is a brief rounding review. It's just kind of one quick page, goes through a couple of examples, talks a little bit about place value and our rounding rules. So if that's something that you may find useful, feel free to go ahead and take a look at that if you haven't already, before we jump into the next example in our notes here for section 1.4.